Okay, I think we're good to go. Thank you very much. Where did my script go? I don't want to wing it. Okay, hi everyone. As I said before, my name is Scott Bellis. I'm the council president of Canadian Actors Equity Association. Welcome to this webinar. Today's session is part 2 of our anti-oppressive communication workshops. A more in-depth look at the concepts and some of the practical exercises that go along with this work. But for those of you here who may not have attended part 1 or seen the video on our YouTube channel, please don't worry. You'll be able to participate in this workshop fully and benefit from it as well. I'm just going to, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement statement as well as Equity's statement of affirmation, which we do at all of our public events. I'm coming to you today from the city of North Vancouver, which is located on the traditional unceded lands of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam First Nations. The Musqueam people and other people of the Salish Sea have made their homes in this area for thousands of years, and their relationship to the lands and waters of this area are ongoing to this day. I'm now going to read our statement of affirmation, which goes like this. Equity embraces an open and inclusive environment and encourages respectful behavior that affirms the dignity of all individuals. Equity further recognizes our shared responsibility for vigilance in creating and maintaining this environment. Equity recognizes a shared history with Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Canada. In honor of those who have gone before us, Equity commits to working toward understanding and actionable practices of reconciliation. Okay, thank you very, very much. All right, moving along then. So welcome to the 9th in a series of workshops and seminars that Equity is proud to bring you on topics of great importance to our members and to our community at large. Equity gratefully acknowledges the Government of Canada for the funding of these programs through the Department of Canadian Heritage as part of their Canada Performing Arts Workers Resilience Fund. Thank you, Government of Canada. After the workshop, we will be sending you all a link to complete a brief survey. We want your feedback on these workshops and your guidance as we plan future ones. Very, very important. Please fill out the survey. Thank you very much in advance. Unlike many of our other sessions, we're running this particular workshop as a Zoom meeting instead of as a webinar. And this is so you will be able to join breakout rooms and interact with the material a little more later on. This session is being recorded and will be made available to members later. So if you do not want your image to appear in the recording, please turn your camera off. Now, to ask a question, you can type it into the chat, and myself or our moderator, Douglas, will be happy to voice it for you, or you can use the raise hand option, and we will call on you to unmute and ask your question at the appropriate time. But please be mindful to stay on mute if you're not speaking, because we will hear you. Okay, now I would like to introduce our facilitator. His name is Douglas Stewart. Douglas brings years of experience as an equity trainer and dispute resolution officer. His work is now focused in the field of human rights, diversity, cultural competence, and organizational change management, providing strategic planning, systems reviews, process facilitation, and a range of professional development services. I invite you to read more about Douglas at the link, which we will share in the chat. I will now hand things over to Douglas. Douglas, it's always great to see you. Thank you for being here with us. Over to you.
Hi, thank you for that introduction, Scott, as always, and a pleasure to be with you. Many of you who've worked with me before know that what tends to happen is that, you know, it's a lot that we're trying to cover in a short amount of time. So going to ask that you bear with us as we move through the content. The reason why we sent out the advanced material is just in case where we get to, we're not able to get through everything. I made sure you have enough information that you can certainly follow up and engage with the material that we may not get a chance to get to. So let's get going. going to share the screen. And so there it goes. I hope I have the right one up. Think so. Okay. And so I always put this up just to make sure we're all in the right place, like we are in session 2 on February 6th. And so had some of that. I was sharing this image with you just because I came across it recently with some of the work I've been doing. And just the reason I'm sharing it with you is just, again, whenever we do a land acknowledgement, I always think it's important that beyond just making the statement, it's about, well, what is the opportunity for learning in the moment? So if any of you have never seen this image before, it is an image titled Manifest Destiny. And it is of a figure of a white woman clothed in sort of angelic appearance, floating across the land, sort of carrying telegraph wires with her. And the idea is this is an image of somebody who is bringing civilization in the name of colonization and in the name of the doctrine of discovery. As you know, when the Pope came recently on the apology tour for the finding of the grave sites, as well as the history of residential schools, this kind of began to be something that emerged as something that they had to acknowledge, that they signed on to, that really gave the colonizers the right and the permission that they were taking basically the religion as well as civilization to what they call, quote unquote, the New World, or whatever territories they find. And that it gave them permission to basically, make people into follow the faith, the Catholic faith particularly, but also just any kind of Christian faith. And along with that as well was an edict that if people did not then go along with that then you basically had a right to do whatever you'd like to them, right? And so in that name of that, many harms were done across the globe. And so this was an image that actually was coined in the US, particularly in the American push west, with the idea that you're bringing this sort of civilization forward. And it was the right and the goal for basically European folks moving across the land. So that image, though, I think is really important that when we have these conversations, we also talk about resistance and to talk about the fact that we're now confronting this history. And I think in some of the work that Equity is doing very similarly. And so just to share this image with you, which is an image which is confronting that old image. And this image basically is really saying, well, now we're in a whole other conversation about, one, if you look on the right side of the image, you can see that, this other clean image that we had of the wonders of technology moving across westward, that in fact it also left pollution, and it left, destructions of our environment. And it's odd that the image is polarized, because I'm sure folks in Vancouver would tell you that there's also geological harms and geographical harm as well, ecological harms there as well. But the whole idea is confronting the other image, and so saying that there's opportunities for Indigenous ways of living and ways of doing things to also challenge. And I would say this is a mirror of lots of other colonized places as well, as we start to have a conversation to really unpack and challenge the histories that we live with. So I just thought I would share these two images with you, and I'm happy to send them out again so that Randy, Ilona, and Ilona can share them with you further if you find them useful. There's lots of information on the internet around these images as well that you can find if you want to get the actual detail of the naming of the figures and the artists who rendered them as well. So I know that if you want to put in the chat if you've ever seen these images or any comments, I mean, we'll just have an engagement like that as we go through the sessions. And so thought also, because we're talking about communication, would be really important to also look at this image, which is an image that gives you some examples of the kinds of histories and the things that language that's used, that's very much looking at power and privilege, right? And there were some questions that were forwarded to us around this session. And while there's sort of more overall questions in terms of how do we set the stage and create an environment, I'm more going to focus on some of the details of how we, deal in moments of challenge or conflict around some of these issues. That you can see that this, for example, is to start to think about language, and language that I know that I've used as part of my vernacular that I learned, not knowing that the histories of them were really positioning me, with the folks in power who were seeing Indigenous people as threats, as the efforts to push westward particularly was happening, and not recognizing that, for a lot of Indigenous people, they probably had their own versions of what they were perceiving and seeing as these folks were pushing again onto their land and pushing them, away and over into corners, right? And so if you think about these different elements of language, so I guess if you want to start to think about any learning moving forward, is to think about, is this in any of our vocabulary? How do we challenge these when we hear them in our spaces? Are they sometimes written into our work? So think about scripts that we're preparing or storylines, and just even the construction, the positioning of who's seen as a threat, who's seen as threatened, and where that power position is also landing, right? Yes, and I see Dina in the chat. Absolutely, Dina. So yes, that's why I'm encouraging you to go online, because you can find the name of the actual artist and some of the background story of those images that I showed before. And so, yes, so hopefully this kinds of language, just to point these out. And again, I just actually this morning thought to add these, and I will send these along as well to Ilona and Randy to share with you further. And again, any comments in the chat is welcome, or any thoughts when you think about these kinds of terms, that are used. And again,
with your Arts Council, Suzanne speaking.
Oh, go ahead.
Hello, how are you doing, Bob? Good.
Is that someone who's?
We are here. Yep, all afternoon.
I think we may have somebody in the meeting who does not have their microphone turned off. So if you're at the meeting and you're listening, please make sure your microphone is off. Thank you very much.
Yes, we're not a webinar today, we're a meeting. So yes, that's sort of the protocol today. So yes, absolutely. Just say this is a tool already to think about incorporating as a mindfulness piece around how we're using language and communicating in the space that we're in. And so then to clarify that what we're doing today is enhancing our knowledge and skills, anti-oppressive communication. We want to be familiar with the different frameworks. So you'll see that in the session, I'm looking at things like positioning from a trauma-informed. The terms that we often hear is calling in or calling out. And then, the idea of tone policing. And I'm raising these really because they're elements of things to consider when you think about creating the kind of communication in the environments that we're in within the industry, right? So, and some of this, of course, as you're looking at these, you can think about them, again, not just for interpersonal, but also how it's happening in terms of in our writing, in our work, in our productions, in our spaces generally. So again, tone policing, gaslighting, internal policing, the experience of code switching, and then white fragility. And when I put white fragility, it's just one example of just think of different fragilities, because when we talk about sexism or misogyny, we know we often talk about mansplaining, for example. So just the idea of where we might find any of us at times when our privilege is on the line that we might feel uncomfortable or challenged, and how that might be a dynamic in how we listen and are open to engaging with each other. But certainly as well, those of us who are positioned to challenge what it means to actually encounter those kinds of fragilities as we're trying to make the case for more equitable engagements in our spaces. And then lastly, it's having a chance to reflect on and practice strategies for how we really give and receive feedback, because often we're talking about this communication. One, it's about how do we set the stage, create the kind of space, that messages right away, this is the expectation for the kind of space we want to hold together. And then it's about when something happens. So when something happens in that space, how do we navigate that? And I would say there's also a follow-up. What is the learnings from what has happened in terms of what we put in place to minimize this happening again? And I say minimize because I've yet to find the utopian space where none of this happens, because we just happen to still have the histories that we have to work through. And so it's really about how do we put in place the best practices we can until, again, we learn more or understand more, and also the systems of support. And I think the fourth would be, what are the resources and the supports for folks who experience harm? And that includes even the folks who do harm, in terms of what are the actually remedial kind of processes available or resources available, whether that's training or discussions or debriefings, as well as then additional kinds of systems that we have to put in place within our spaces to make sure that the messaging continues. And so it's really about how do we continue to keep creating the kind of workspace that is the goal. Hope that makes sense, because that's the plan that we have, and we'll work with what's happening, but really that's what we'll be working on. And so as we're going through the agenda, going to move into some considerations for giving and receiving feedback. And so you'll see that we'll start to tackle some of the concepts and elements I talked about earlier. And really a frame that I get people to think about is that we're trying to achieve accountability in our spaces with each other, less so punishing. So the initial goal is not about punishing, it's really about accountability, right, for how we engage with each other. And then I think the other thing to be mindful of is the performance. Is it just performative? Are we just doing it? And, you know, lately I've been listening to a lot of news and reading a lot about this idea of people's engagement with the idea of woke and wokeism. Didn't realize that it was a concept, but this idea that sometimes the ways that we might engage with this is about how it looks. It looks that we're addressing these issues, or how we're positioned to seem to know more than other folks, but is it really about that what we're doing is really creating the kind of change or the kinds of spaces and having the kind of impact that is necessary, as opposed to you know, just the look of it all, right? And so you'll see that concept emerging as we keep working through the session. And then the second half, I would say, of this is really thinking about trauma-informed care and the communication we're talking about. So trauma-informed care really begins to think about the histories that we carry and how we carry them each personally and how we navigate them as part of communities that have been harmed historically and continue to be harmed, frankly. I mean, if we think of the conversations that are around trans communities and even the rollback of certain legislations, particularly down south, but we know that globally there's some places where this conversation is not yet on the table, while acknowledging that globally across the globe, there's been histories where you know, the idea of gender diversity in its expression and identification has always been part of who we have been, and that at different points in history, a sort of colonizing messaging began to deny that. And so it's really about how we just push back against efforts to reclaim that, as opposed to that we're going somewhere new. I think that's a really important thing to challenge, this idea that we're doing something that goes against everything we've ever known, when in fact, actually what it's doing is actually returning us back to what we did know pre some of the negotiations that's happened in the interim to where we are now to try to reclaim some of that. So you'll see that, you know, as a result, there is a colonial legacy to engage with. Many of us are constantly navigating environments where we're code switching. And then also the movement from just allyship as a sort of a codified way of talking about engaging. And you'll see that I have some slides about how that shifts to solidarity, right? And how we show up in the work. And so that's kind of the frame for what we're going to be doing in the conversation. So I shared these, by the way, I had put a file in the chat and I'll add it again just as more people have come on so that you have this. It's the CAEA addendum. You'll see it pop up in the chat now. So you can actually download that to your computers, and apologies to the interpreters if you can pull those off as well, and hopefully those are helpful. And I'll make sure these get sent along again as well with the other additional slides. And so I added these. I won't go through them just for time because I didn't have them initially, but based on some of the questions that came through the last few days, I thought it was important because I think an answer to some of the questions that you posed, one about how do you balance power in the space, two, when harm is done, how do you address that? And then three, the impact and implications for folks who are also you know, balancing different disabilities and so on in the space. And I think also different interests, frankly, and rights in the space that might be challenging each other. I think, again, as I said before, setting the tone. And I think it's really about how is everyone in the space having agreements about expectations for how we're going to engage and hold space with each other. And so you can see that this is a list that hopefully you're working with. And I would say that first day talk is a really important place to think about. Are the elements in that talk or even setting the tone for how you're going to work together with a group of people? Is that clear? How's that clearly set up a message in terms of expectations? And also even talk about how do we then navigate when there are conflicts, when issues do come up, so folks are prepared or not as surprised when those moments are then called or named and are pretty much checked in around their agreement to cooperate with those kinds of processes when you get into those kinds of situations. So I just share that with you. And again, you can see much of it fits also with a virtual component, but if you take it apart, you can also see how it can apply. And of course, this is just one example that you can add to. And I'm wondering also if many of you already have these kinds of agreements in place in the spaces that you're in and navigating with each other, just to start to reflect on that. And this slide as well, I've added just because it begins to set the tone for also thinking about the idea of triggers and harm done, and the idea of when you started to talk trauma-informed care and approaches. And so, for example, we're in a conversation today with each other, and if you think about setting the tone for how we're going to work together, is to be clear that, you know, some of this, it's not, it sometimes can feel very unsafe. And while we talk about creating safe environments, I tend to push for the word safer, because the idea of the goal of safety depends on so many things that it's difficult to promise or commit or guarantee. And so, of course, we want to have what I call ethical agreements with each other to make sure we're creating as safe a space as possible, knowing that sometimes, because we're going to go into difficult subject matter, challenging subject matter that different people have different histories with, that, you know, it might land and impact people in different ways, right? And so you'll find that then for some of us in the conversation, some of the examples of our discussions may be very theoretical. It may be very much, oh, I'm curious about that. That's very interesting, a little bit removed from my experience. So I can talk about it very, I feel, objectively, even though I think that's also a very contested term, because I think always a subjectivity in how we're engaging with any kind of content. And so being mindful of that is just how it's landing for different folks, because sometimes we're talking about our lived experience. And I say sometimes because I don't think there's ever any time where it's always that we're talking about at a distance, or we're always the person being targeted, or it's about our story. But I think we're coming in and out of that in very dynamic ways. And sometimes we can also assume, if you think about the spaces you're in that you're co-creating, is to never make assumptions about how any topic we're talking about might land for folks. Because if it's not even their personal self-identified lived experience, it might be a community that they're part of, family that they're part of, relationship that they're in, children that they're raising. So there's lots of ways in which issues might trigger and create a differential experience for folks. So it's just being mindful of that, of how we're navigating, moving with our privilege. And so how we might think about how we're sharing or asking questions or telling stories with each other. And then the other side of that is also for those of us who are in this experience to really take care of ourselves, really check in with ourselves around, as for example, I'm going to be showing a couple of videos that might land in you in certain ways. So I would say, unfortunately, we have to do that to have the conversation, but certainly as it's happening for you, to be mindful of how you take care of yourself in that experience. So hopefully that is helpful just to think about, and to think about how that could be a way to also preface any space that you're creating, to just check in with folks about that. Because we're in this kind of format for a couple of hours and there's a bit we want to go through, you know, I would have probably in a session with more time would have stopped and paused and let's have a conversation together as a group about how this lands for each other. So just to think about that as a exercise you could also do with a team. So just pausing for a bit to see how that lands for folks. Any comments, any reflections? Okay, and I see some notes in the chat just about breakout rooms. And yes, I know Randy and Ilona are managing that. And I think they're going to do about 6 or 7. I leave it to them how many that works for them to break folks out. So yes, I understand that you might be in and out as we go. So appreciate letting us know, Nicole, and others as well. Nicole, appreciate the slide. Okay, and I know some of you, let's keep moving. So you have the slide so we can certainly follow up further. So I'm gonna right away get you into a breakout group. So this is the first breakout group, and this breakout group I think is gonna guide the session, because what I really felt was important in this session, based on the feedback from some of the other sessions that we've done, is your chance to talk about the kinds of situations that you might find that you're engaging in. And I think, you know, while I'm here to facilitate from my experience and expertise, you have lived experience in this industry in ways that you could also share and bring back to the larger group. So process is that you're going to go off in your small groups and you're going to think about situations that you've had to navigate, you know, and where you had to give feedback or have a conversation engagement around it, and it didn't go well, right? And so, you know, the ones where you're finding why you'd come to a session like this, because you're thinking, when we were in that, I wasn't sure what to do and how we could have done that better. And so just to talk about what is the difficulty about receiving the feedback, and then how can we give it, you know, in a way that is going to be much more helpful to sort of the outcome that you'd like. So that is more supportive and clear, right? And so second part of the conversation you're going to have is to think about another situation where it went well. And what are the elements that made it go so well, right? And if you're struggling with that, just to listen and appreciate other participants in the group that you're in and what they'll say. And so when we come back, we'll hear from a few groups, And then I'll move you through some of the other slides that you've received already about what are some best practices and some things to consider. And we'll open it up for some certainly dynamic dialogue and questions or clarifications as we go along.
Douglas, I'm just going to interject here for a moment, and just to let any participants know who may require the use of ASL interpretation inside the breakout rooms, that if that is the case and you're using the interpreters, could you please send them a direct message through the chat to let them know, so that we can make sure we get one of the interpreters into that room. Thank you very much.
Great. And so wonder then, Randy, I know you'll sort of send people off and give them the time. I think we said for this is going to be about 15 minutes. Just so you have a good amount of time to have the conversation. And I see some folks saying they have children around, they may have to leave. I mean, if it is that you can still stay on and mute and your children are around, I'm used to doing sessions with children, in laps and jumping around or doing things, as long as if you're able to stay on and keep an ear out, that would be great. So please don't hesitate because of us. At this point, it's not a disruptive force in terms of visually or auditorially, so you can just decide. But thank you for letting us know. Thank you, Grace. That research right away. Thank you. The rest of us are quietly hanging in.
Have the breakout rooms been
It seems so.
made? Is this our room? Is this our room? Is this the main room?
Yes, this is the main room.
Okay, because we've got a few participants here. So this is our breakout room then. Is that what I understand? Oh, fantastic.
No, this is the main room. But if someone doesn't accept the breakout room join,
Oh, I see,
then
I
they
see.
just sit here. So they might have walked away from their computer or what have you.
Okay, because I'm seeing Dina and I'm seeing Susan Curry here and Jessica.
Yeah, I can manually move them to the other room, but I'm trying not to be pushy.
Yeah.
And this is
Okay.
usual. This is usual with these sessions. There's a few people who don't make it to the breakout room.
Oh, I thought I was going to get sent to one. So
Oh,
Oh, sorry, Scott. We
well,
can
that's okay.
we can arrange for that.
That's
you wanna
okay.
be in one?
They're all people are already in session, so I'll just hang out here.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all right.
And this is really the core of the session, to surface and generate different situations. And so we'll see what people come back with.
Okay.
If you can get through this piece, and the next piece is the trauma informed with the colonial story, and then the This Is Us. That would be this. It's really the three discussions.
Right. It's funny, Douglas, I didn't see the comment in the chat about somebody having their kids around. Did it get sent to you privately?
Yes.
Oh, I
Yeah,
see. Okay.
yeah, a few people said yes. Oh, sorry, I should say, yeah, I'm getting
That's
a
okay.
private
That's
chat.
okay. I just wanted to make sure everything was working on my end.
A couple of people, yeah, did popped in and then let me know privately that unfortunately they had to step back out because something's come up. And then some folks said that they're actually on the road. They're literally traveling and trying to listen in as they're traveling.
Yeah.
They'll drop in and out.
If someone's listening on the phone, how do they automatically get sent to a breakout room? How does that work?
I am not sure what
Right.
they
I
have there.
believe they still get a notification on the phone to like click the button to go to it.
Yeah, unless they're really just listening, Randy.
Oh, you mean, yeah. Yeah, you mean if they just phoned in as opposed to joined through a Zoom app? Yeah. Yeah, in that case, they don't get sent to a breakout room.
I don't think so. Yeah.
No. But I would imagine most people nowadays, even if you're on your phone, are probably using a Zoom app to connect that way.
Mhm.
Douglas, I've got the 3 questions that were submitted beforehand here in my email, and I'm just going to wait and see what kind of conversations pop out of the breakout rooms to see if there's a good way to insert those in. So just so you know, I've got them standing by.
Great.
How did she find that painting? I started doing all kinds of Google searches. After I saw it, I was like,
If you're putting confronting manifest, if you put in manifest destiny.
Oh, manifest destiny. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't
It
think of
pops
that.
up. No, she has a name.
Is that Kent Monkman exhibit that was on? I don't know if it's still on at the Ontario Museum, the Ontario
Yes.
Museum.
At the ROM. Yes, I did go see it. Yeah.
Yes. When I was there in November, I went and saw it. It was pretty powerful.
Yeah, I found it myself too.
So how many people have we got inside breakout rooms right now?
I'm seeing 5 rooms of 5 minus
Oh.
3 people. So 22,
21.
21.
Yeah, 21, and I'm counting us that are not in the room. So yeah, we have 21 in.
It's about 28 or 25, 27 people on.
What was the pre-registration for this event? Randy, curious to know.
60 some odd.
Oh, okay. So the general trend with these is half the registrants generally show up. Seems to be pretty common. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, it's always been, I mean, maybe in the past it's been different here, but in my experience, even at Actra, was always, if you give a free workshop, you get about half. If you give a workshop that even costs like $5, if somebody's made some kind of monetary commitment, then you're probably looking more at like 95%. So it's just one of those things.
Yeah, somebody told me that once about when you give free stuff, you get less.
Yeah, nobody shows up.
Yeah, people invest, but it's also you assign a value to a workshop that where they say there's a nice little point where people go, wow, this workshop's a great price for the value I'm going to get. They pay for it and then they come to it. If it's free, it's like, oh, I might as well sign up, and then you forget about it. And if it's too expensive, they don't do it at all. So there's this nice little sweet spot where people go, ah, that tax seminar was really worth the $10.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so the name of the figure is Columbia.
Columbia. That's right.
And the book that she's carrying, the title on that you can't see it. If you go close in, the book is titled Manifest Destiny. And then I'm looking for reversing Manifest Destiny, I think is the title of the next one. Yeah, reversing Manifest Destiny. Yeah.
The female national personification of the United States. Oh my God. Wow.
Yeah, and the artist's name is Charles Hilliard for Reversing Manifest Destiny.
Is that the name of the painting? Reversing Manifest Destiny?
The first one is titled American Progress
Right.
by John Gass, but the
Yep.
one I'm going to put in the information chat, the one that the second one with the indigenous image is called Reversing Manifest Destiny.
Right.
And the artist is Charles Hilliard. Yeah. Let's see if this is not open.
Douglas, should I broadcast about 2 minutes to close the break?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, Douglas, I've closed all the rooms, so participants have about a minute to come back to the main
Okay,
room.
great. I think we have everyone back now. Everyone's been floated back in. Great, thank you for that. Just so you know, in the chat, we've had Grace, graciously, shared the information about the Manifest Destiny painting. And then I've also put in the chat, I'll put it again, because I think when you're in breakout rooms, it might not show up. So I'll put it again. And the second image as well, we put the information in the chat. So, and you can also, of course, research that further online if you'd like. So let's get going. We'll hear from a few folks, and verbally, maybe a few groups. So the first question is, some examples sometimes when it didn't go so well and why. What are some reasons why? So we can surface some of that in our conversation. So anybody from a group would like to just start us off and share? We didn't ask for a formal reporter, but hopefully somebody will be.
I'll talk. Let me just get my video here. One of the times that it didn't go well is when both myself and the other either group or organization or person didn't have the skills to take it further other than the first observation. So if I brought up some feedback about something in that script that was challenging and in my view not appropriate, I can take it to a certain level, but oftentimes with our skill, because this is all new, right? With the skill level, we're, both me and the one on the other side of the table, we're trying to bring our skills up. But it's challenging when we don't have the tools.
So without the skills and the tools. Okay, thank you. Anyone else or any other group?
I'd be happy to share from group 5 if that's all right with the women I was in there with. That some of the difficulties were around getting and giving feedback, as it's both positive and negative. When you get feedback, even positive, it can be hard to take if you're not used to being open with other people. And that there can be fear in the room. We can take it personally. That's one of the big things we talked about, is taking things personally. And as humans, we tend to focus on the negative as opposed to the positive and dismissing the positive. So I think those are some of the negatives that we talked about as getting in the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. And also I see Alice has put in the chat when there's also a lack of interest, right? Don't really care for the feedback, not welcoming it. Any others? Hear from again, at least one more on that first piece. Lara, thank you.
I can talk for group 1 if that's all right. In terms of when feedback didn't seem to go well, some of the common themes amongst examples seem to be when feedback was given right in the moment of heated emotion, when emotional levels were really high. And of course, with the subject that we're dealing with, that's often the case. And so that without some sober second thought, sometimes the feedback came out not in the most constructive way. And then also when feedback was ever given in a way that was shameful to the person receiving it, that it did not have the intended effect. And then the reverse of that was when feedback went well, that the person giving the feedback always assumed that the person to whom they were giving feedback was doing the best they could in any given moment, and to take them aside and have a private one-on-one conversation, human to human, versus trying to make a show of it. Or as we were talking about earlier, is it performative? That it was not performative, that it was really, can we have a conversation? And then again, some of that emotional reaction level was able to simmer down and actually allow people to have a little more of a dialogue.
Thank you. And you're sort of leading us into the, when it goes well, what conditions help it to go well, right? So thank you for that, Lara. And so just to recap, when it's not gone well, don't have the skills or tools, not really an interest in the feedback. People take it very personally, very quickly. It's very personalized as opposed to what I said or did, not who I am. A fear in the room. It happens in the heat of the moment, so there's not even enough time to kind of step back, think about what's happening, prepare yourself, and even for the other party to have a time to sort of recalibrate themselves and be open to the feedback. And then also it's given it more as a shameful, like it's not really about helping someone's learning, it's about actually sort of catching them out, or sometimes using it as an opportunity to sort of tear them down in a way, in some cases, right? Did I miss anything, or anybody think of anything else when you think what makes it just not go well? So I'll flag something because one of the areas I know where it can be challenging is when there's power differentials structurally, like somebody's a much more senior role in the production. Somebody's also more, I'm sure in your industry, positioned with more power to determine employment, potential casting opportunities, right? And all those, or work to work. And so in those moments too, it's like, oh, I don't know if I'd even bother giving the feedback because of the worry about the impact and implications, particularly if it doesn't go well, right? So I was just flagging that one because it's always the sort of elephant in the room around, do we do this with everyone when there's power in the room, right? Anything else I might be missing? I'm seeing here calling in rather than public calling out, right? So that's when you're moving into more positive. And then power. Thank you, Valerie's added the power, racial or cultural differences. So thank you for that. Well, let's move into what helps it go well. And already Laura started us off by, when we take people aside, right? Not in a public kind of space, some privacy, one-on-one. And then there's a feeling that there's a real, I want to help you, somebody to understand or learn something here and appreciate something here. And then there's time, that there's actually time to actually do it. Is there anything else that some of your groups talked about where it went well? Like what conditions helped it to go well? And again, you can pop it in the chat as well, but we'd love to hear some voices, which is why we made it a meeting. So if anybody like to weigh in, and Laura kind of started us off, so anybody else want to add?
I'm seeing a hand from Kyle.
Okay, great.
Kyle, go ahead.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, we spoke about how useful room agreements can be because it's a hopefully shared expression of shared values that you can point to. If we've gone off track, it's helpful to refer back to that structure.
And I like that you said shared values. You established right up front. Yeah, so we're agreeing that this is the way we want to work and it's a shared agreement, right? Great, thank you. Valerie.
Thank you. Yes, I appreciated from the women talking about being able to slow down and breathe in the moment of heat, and the idea of having genuine curiosity rather than reacting. What else? Yes, to separate the person from the role, speak to the specifics of what happened versus the person, and to lead with the positive. One last thing was inviting people to correct you and being open to learning. Thank you.
Thank you for those, Valerie. And that last one you said is such an important piece in even that you saw, I sent you some slides that had some steps. And one of the steps at the end is always that checking with, even though we're giving the feedback, to say, how does that sound? And do you have any thoughts about that? Because yeah, absolutely. There might be something in the dynamic that they might want to surface about how we're engaging. So it doesn't feel like it's a talking to or a finger waving, but it's about, as was set up earlier, if we have these agreements and we're kind of pulling each other back into those agreements, is we're in a shared conversation in an ongoing kind of way, right? A theme that I would like to highlight, two themes that are already emerging for me, is how we start to think, and this is, I'm just, again, borrowing language that I'm using in other industries I'm working with. And the language is the idea that we're in a community of care with each other. We're creating collective care with each other. And one of the hallmarks of your policies and even the bylaws of equity is really that the goal of this is to bring people in. The goal of all this work is not about, knocking people out or tearing people down. The goal of all this work that we're doing is about how do we bring people in? And then we'll talk a bit about at what point does that then become, we hit a boundary, we hit a wall where to say, all right, now we've got to call people out, right? And we look at some of the criteria for that, but you're really setting the stage for that in what you've just been sharing. The other thing that you talked about is, I thought another principle is a community of learning. And the very first thing that was said earlier is that, some of this feels really new to get our hands and feet into and our whole bodies and souls into, because we're in a current time where, we're still really living with the legacy of the pandemic, if not still in it, frankly. And then we're also living with the just confrontation of so much that's been happening. And then we just had the recent, killing of the young man in Memphis, right? And so, and of course, the ongoing, the recent case that's reemerged with the RCMP from 2017 of the Indigenous man who was also killed, right? And so on and so on. And Joyce Echaquan, and we could go on and on. It just continues around us. And trans folks, women, Michigan murdered Indigenous women, as well as women generally who are still victims of violence. And we live in an environment now where we're really confronting a lot of these conversations, I think in a much more head-on way and more thoughtful way. And how do we keep that sustained? Because we've already seen that level of engagement start to, kind of whittle away as we've gone back to quote unquote normal again. So the interest that was there is starting to shift a little bit. So I think Equity is saying, no, Equity actually started this journey ahead of some of all of that. And so it's how do we keep that momentum going? So again, collective care, communities of care, and communities of learning. So if you think of that as a framing for even when we're naming that very explicitly in our first day talk, or when we get together in any kind of production team in our industry, how do we set that as a tone for then those shared values about how we want to interact and hold it and keep bringing each other in as we keep moving forward. So anything else, any other group have anything additionally that helps to create positive conditions for helping this to go well? What helped it to go well? And I'm, slow down and breathe. Genuine curiosity was another one I heard as well. And it's about the issue of the incident, not the person, so not personalizing. All right, we'll keep moving. I mean, we'll add on. And again, as I'm doing this with you, I know some of you, this is a chance for us to check in, because I have to say, as I do these workshops, I'm thinking a lot of what we're talking about, we kind of learned all the way through our lives from the time we were wee ones, going into sort of collective environments, but it's about how do we revisit it and say, what does it mean in these environments? And what does it mean when there's nuance? So let's keep going on with the nuance, because some of it, as someone put in the chat, it's also when there's also, other aspects that we've not had to think about before in terms of how power works, in terms of race and cultural difference. And it's also when we're now confronting colonial ways of doing things. So, there's a whole decolonizing goal that we're in. I mean, I have some other piece that we're now doing with certain groups around decolonization, decolonizing practices. And so as we're doing that, I think we're much more heartily leaning into things and leaning into ways to think about this. So we're going to keep moving along, and I'm going to just go through some slides now that will probably reinforce some of what we're talking about. But in the chat, or even just to check in, and Scott's paying attention to who might want to chat, so put your hand up or let him know, or if you send him a private message, and then we can just relate to these slides as we're going along. So just again, why would we call each other out, right? Or in. So why do we give feedback? Why is communication so important, how we do this? And so you can see there, and again, you've had these slides, so I won't be reading them through because you have them, but just noting again, we're stopping certain harmful behaviors. We want to, again, if we start to think of that frame of the kind of communities we're creating, that's compassionate space for the ways we're engaging with each other. And then also the fact that we have to confront really difficult, sometimes challenging conversations. And I would say that many of the kinds of productions that you're creating in many ways, besides the usual traditionals that we keep revisiting, and even the way we're revisiting some productions, we're taking up certain kinds of issues in different ways now that I can support this. So I think it's also how do you draw alignment with what's happening in the room and in the space, and how we come together and create community with what is also going on with the productions that we're bringing to performance as well. And then calling in quite specifically, you can see there it's again bringing whatever issues there are to the attention of another person where potentially harm is being done or is having adverse impact. And one of the things that also helps folks to think more gently in how we engage with each other is intent versus impact. So I know that when I get feedback, and I think of one example is, and I may have shared it before in the other session, but when I was with a colleague on a break, lunch break, I went to purchase something at a convenience store. And as I was leaving the store, the cashier gave me change for a 10 when I gave him a $20 bill. And I was walking out of the store, I began to go on about how, can you see how that guy tried to gyp me? And of course, my colleague looked at me and kind of sort of with a grin kind of said, a chuckle, she said, did you just say gypped? And I kind of looked, yeah, and then I caught myself just in what just came out of my mouth. I said, oh my goodness, oh, you know what? Yeah, you're right, right? You know, and because I realized in that moment I was perpetuating again an idea, a stereotype with a group of people we refer to now as Roma folks. And I always say to folks when people have asked me, well, why is that such a thing, and where'd that come from? And of course, that terminology and association came from the histories of Roma folks not being allowed to own property, particularly in Europe when they were there. And so as a result, they had to resort to other ways of survival. And unfortunately, one of the options was how they would, you know, have to perform tricks or magic or tell storytelling, or various ways to kind of survive on the street. This was similar for Jewish people, frankly, because the other term that sometimes people would use for the same was association with Jewish folks, right? Which is where, when you think of the Merchant of Venice and those kinds of stories and productions and so on, you know, began to engage with those kinds of ideas. And so it's just, again, we recognize that this is about how any of us at any point in our own kind of unlearning, on unpacking much of what's gone in there, may find that this comes out of us. So how do we make sure that we're working our way, like my colleague did, to say, hey, I know you, I appreciate that you would want to learn this, as you said earlier, so let me give you this feedback in as gentle way as I can. So as one example. And then you see it, the second part that I've highlighted, just a key thing with that is what you've just been saying, that what kind of community are we creating that says that folks with this community, we are committed to some expectations with each other, and we are open to getting feedback when that our behavior is inconsistent with that, right? So just to talk about how calling in works very principally. The other thing to say about calling in that's really important as well is that, you know, there is a number of schools of thought about recognizing that we all are on different kinds of journeys, we learn in different kinds of ways, and also that idea of calling into community is so key, because what can happen often, sometimes, or sometimes, I should say often, sometimes, is this idea that it is a moment of sort of like, you know, pinning someone down, or, you know, being very punitive, as I said earlier. So rather than accountability, it becomes more of a punitive piece, and it's a performative things, right? I want to show someone up in a certain kind of way. So just us to be mindful of why calling in can be a really, you know, important option and choice for how we actually bring people in and give feedback. And again, Scott, let me know if there's any questions or comments as we're going along.
Yes, I will.
Thank you. And so I just put this and just see any reactions. So when you read this slide, any comments, and again, you put it in the chat, or you can, you know, speak out louder if you want. So when I read out loud, this is literally what it's like to be a part of a marginalized group. Politeness is met with a refusal to listen, and anger is met with demands for politeness. So any comments about that as you've heard that? Or does that resonate for any of you? Any thoughts on this statement? So you think about in what kinds of situations do you see this, observe this experience, or you've experienced this yourself? And whenever there's pause and I'm mindful of time, I move on. And so I'll just go to this idea of tone policing. So that slide before, really, and I'll just flip back to it again. This slide is speaking to the experience of many marginalized folks, right? Where in the history of activism or trying to change our culture in a society to a bit more open and progressive culture, the resistance is real, right? In terms of, you know, the way that we're expected to communicate that, and the way that we're expected to challenge power, because the message really is don't challenge power. The message usually is, no, we like things the way we are. I mean, I have to tell you, and even share with you, being on this journey with equity, I remember it's shifting over time, because that's usually what happens. But initially, folks really were struggling with the idea of much of this work, because they felt it was stifling creativity, right? It was taking risks, and that in fact, theater and all, and what we do shouldn't be safe, because we're telling stories that people learn from when it's even much more, you know, challenging and particularly unsafe. But really what it came down to is about what it meant to really question the ways of always doing things, right? And so often then you're then pricking at certain people's privileges, and you're pricking at also people's different comfort levels with engaging with these issues. That's making sense to folks. And so some of the ways that then that would happen is, as you saw on the slide, tone policing, right? And, you see the definition there, it's this idea about, well, even though what we're saying might be reinforcing histories of oppression, discrimination, and frankly, trauma, however you bring it up, it should be nice. It shouldn't make anybody uncomfortable. It shouldn't wobble, what is happening. And in fact, you should kind of be patient and take your time with all of this, right? And so then you get this piece here that then the feedback often to people is that, could you frame that really differently? Or why do you have to be so angry? Or, any of that. And you can see the examples there that are listed. And just to think about if you've ever heard these or you've ever said them, and I have to tell you, I'm, just to say, being real with you, some of these have come out of my mouth at times because I've sometimes been the person in power who is being challenged or criticized in terms of my own, movement through society and culture, where I don't have to think about things. So I don't have to think about, for example, translation in Anglo-Canada. I don't have to think about, my ability to hear and process, in terms of my gender identity and my navigation of society, and my educational status. And frankly, even the region of the country that I live in that has many resource privileges compared to other parts of the country, for example, right?
There's a couple of comments in the chat here, Douglas, that about power differential and how it's perpetuated from Anna. Thank you, Anna. And that refusal to listen, or that you have to communicate in a certain specific way in order to be heard. And from Sam, reminding me of something I heard once about how there's no right way to protest. People will always find a reason that you should react differently. And there's a few other comments on that. So that this idea of tone policing seems to be resonating with people.
Right. And somebody talked about professionalism, and I think that's a really important one because we hear it in a lot of corporate settings I work with. There's this often pushback about, but there's a way that we need to hold, and you hear the word standards, professional standards, right, and a way of doing things. And that would be an interesting thing to start to engage with as an industry, to talk about, well, what does it mean to show up professionally in our industry? And what does that look like in terms of the culture that we're creating, right? In terms of how do we have these engagements around shifting paradigms for how we create the work we create, and how we hold spaces with each other to do that kind of creating and production making. Right? And thank you for lots of really good quotes in the chat. Right? But the thing to do as you're in this, I think, is really powerful when we're having these kinds of discussions, is to think about, yes, what happens around us, but really also do self-reflection in terms of what happens for you in you as well. So that's why I'm saying, start to think about, is there my own work personally in terms of how I've looked at myself and the ways in which sometimes I find this language also comes up, or if it doesn't come out of my mouth, I know sometimes it doesn't come out of my mouth, but I'm thinking it, I'm feeling it in my body as well. So just to be mindful of that as we're moving along. And so when we go into calling out then, and we go into calling out because unfortunately, sometimes things aren't changing around us, or behavior keeps being repeated. Or, I remember once being a part of a working group, and people kept using the term, rather than saying, 2S LGBTQ plus IA, or LGBT for short, or queer even, they kept using the term alphabet people, right? Oh, the alphabet people, isn't that what you alphabet people want? And I want to say that even the tone was very derisive, it was very dismissive, and it was very patronizing. And eventually I had to call it, it kept happening. I'd initially sort of softly kind of say, I think the preference is blah, blah, blah. And eventually I just had to take a stand and be quite, I would say not even assertive, I think I lost it and said, enough. And it's kind of when you reach that point that we want to appreciate when calling out becomes also critical and important. Or if also tone policing keeps happening, as an example, right? And so you can see the slide here is like, we want to be really clear, really firm. And even when it's happening maybe the one time in the presence of many others, it is probably because it has, been called in before. And it's such an extreme harm that, we feel like we have no other option to do this as well, right? And also it might be a way to kind of quickly just say, this is serious, stop. And think about the times that you yourselves have found yourself in those moments where, okay, this is really cross the line. And I'll use an example. Some of you might even have been there. At one of the AGMs, and it was when Kristen, who was with us before, and he was his last session, and we decided to do some role play, and one of the role plays got a bit out of hand, and the audience began to react, and it actually didn't go that well. And it was a learning for me that even in that moment, we had devised something that actually began to create some harm in the space. And so eventually people had to sort of call it. And that was to myself, Kristen, and a number of other people were, presenting this. So it put us on pause. We actually recalibrated the whole session, took a break, and then we had to come in and do some kind of, clearing the air. And then we had to identify, actually, I think we identified a smudge outside as well to, kind of heal the experience that we had just been in. So as to say that as I'm doing this with you, even in my work and my journey with equity, I have stumbled. I have been part of processes and helped facilitate processes where in hindsight you go, learned something there. In fact, not that this role plays wouldn't have been helpful, but maybe to have paused them or managed them and structured them a little bit differently. So it's again, in your own production, in your own performance halls and, rehearsal halls, I don't want any of you to feel like this is about, again, we hear the term political correctness, wokeism. No, it's about tackling this with as somebody said earlier, the resources and tools that we can identify as we keep moving, and being able to self-reflect and learn as we move on, and acknowledge in the moments when something has gone off the rails to actually check in and keep kind of, in our commitment to do this work, that we're not always going to be perfect at it, but to, make sure we're putting in place the tools, the resources, and the approaches that are going to be helpful. That helps. Yeah, and I'm seeing some folks commenting about the professionalism. Yeah, keep those chat pieces coming. And here, again, not a long time on these. You can see the difference between calling and calling out and the different levels of influence, calling in, you're somebody. And this is where people ask about power. When you have power, one of the things you can role model when you're in a power position is that you yourself, like a good example is what I'm doing in this workshop. When you yourself can acknowledge that you may stumble, that you're a model for somebody who's open to feedback, you're a model for someone who's acknowledging when you don't get it right. When you model that, it creates a certain comfort level in the space for, okay, don't have to totally walk on eggshells. I don't have to totally feel we can do this together. And if in fact I get called in or even called out, it's part of the culture here. Leadership models, it demonstrates it. They're open to it. It feels like it's a more normalized way that we're going to work together. And so influence goes a really long way, right? And this is also when we're in a position of power. So if I'm a man in a space and misogyny or sexism is happening, and I am also positioned to name that and call that out, that is also really important, right? If we're white-skinned, call it racism, or if we're any ethnic group that sees something else happen to another ethnic group in a space, or just think about any place of power that you occupy, how your word as an ally, as somebody in solidarity can be really important. Scott.
Yeah, I just thought I'd insert a couple of the questions that we received before the workshop because they seem to relate to where we are right now. And one of those questions was, how do those in positions of power create a framework or a technique to mitigate power imbalance? Or I guess the question is, how can we get people to do that? And then the other question that I thought was relating to this was, what are some tools to help us address and repair harm if and when it does occur? I think you've been through this, but I just wanted to mention those questions because they do seem to be on people's minds as we work through this conversation.
Thank you, Scott. Absolutely. And I think, hopefully as we move through what Scott, I would like to do is to leave some time at the end to revisit those to see if there's any areas left to comment on, because I think as we're going to go through, we're going to address some pieces, but thank you, because that's important for other people to hear if they're holding those questions, to also keep thinking about that as well. And an example to Grace has put in the chat, an example of really how to call in an issue when it occurs on a Zoom session, and the offer of resources, right? Because again, it's that piece around how do, one, we address harm that may have happened or what people might need in that moment, and then two, what it means when we're in the position of power in a space to create the frameworks for that to be a space that's much more equitable for folks to engage in and safer to engage in as well. Thank you. And so again, you can see this hopefully all fits: safety, openness, whether it's a calling in or calling out experience, right? And the key one that always with calling out is when we've tried before, it doesn't seem that it's shifting, so we now have to call folks out. Now, you might also have to wonder, is there a point at which also in terms of leadership, where you might have to say to someone who is constantly having to be called out that they're not seeming to cooperate with creating the kind of space that we want, the community we want. And so that sounds like another level of conversation with folks in the power to do so, to address those behaviors. So accountability again, what does accountability look like? And in the corporate, what we call progressive discipline, so a progressive kind of process to eventually say, are you able to continue to cooperate with the kind of community we're trying to create? And if you're not, what does that mean? Now, equity, of course, has a whole process when it comes to raising an issue, but it may be going to say Haven, for example, as another resource, but also, equity also has staff and resources to also assist with how to navigate when you're in those moments where you're saying, wait a minute, we're in a situation, it doesn't seem to be getting better. What are some options that we have for pursuing and moving through? And then calling in, calling out, you can see language that's here. And again, for time, I'm going to keep us moving on this because I think these are pretty straightforward for folks, right? So you can see on the calling in, I'm curious, curiosity, as people said earlier, people having different experiences of situations, and then just asking people more questions. That's a really good tactic when you're calling somebody in, tell me more about why you want, what you think, because and then you can offer, but here's my perspective or another way of thinking about it. And the thing to emphasize, people said, is impact rather than intent, impact. So it's not about you. You're probably because I know I'm a pretty decent person, but I might say something that causes harm. And so it's how I hear that what I'm saying or how I'm behaving is perpetuating oppression or causing harm. And then calling out, you can see this is much more assertive positioning, right? Very assertively saying very clearly what's expected. And it might be that in a calling out moment, you'll likely revisit, you might pull that person aside later on, but maybe in the moment of how serious something is, or if you're in process of trying to accomplish something else and you're saying, I've got to call it out because we've got to move on, but I know later I need to do a follow-up and checking with that person for what occurred and why I had to, call them out in that way. The risk of calling out sometimes is that you might then get into a back and forth. And so again, this is where you have to rely on what's the culture we've created, so you can also frame the calling out assertively as part of, because you're honoring a commitment that we made as a group that, and may have to also say to someone, who wants to debate it, that we may have to come back to this. And maybe that's also what you agree on as a group up front, that if we do get in a moment and we have to do this, what are some strategies for how we want to move that forward? And so then the feedback, you can see here, I statements, as I said, you describe when I see or observe a certain experience, this is the impact. So I feel, or it could impact others in this way. And why? Because as much as you're valued, like my friend was saying to me, hey, you're a good colleague and buddy, but when you said, I worry about the impact for others, right? So if it's a direct thing with somebody you don't know as well, it's because I thought or I believed, but I hope that you would have been different in terms of how you thought you would have a different position. And in future, I would like, in future, you to think about your words, or for us to think about how we, continue to have these conversations. And then as someone said earlier, be able to add, what do you think? Can we talk about this a bit more? And maybe not right now, but maybe even another time. So to commit to another time to do that. And so again, pretty straightforward, timely, describe behavior. Again, some of this you've been saying, right, that will help to create the kind of environment. And then receiving feedback. Now, this is a tough one more often. And so, when that happens, it's about that pause. As folks said earlier, what are the best practices? Well, if you have time, if it's private, so you get a chance to pause, to listen, right? And even a space to acknowledge. And then your own reflection, whether in the moment or, because I've sometimes had to say to people, I need to go think about this a little bit more. But I'm clear that something has happened here that I don't even know if I understand completely or even that I agree with, but I need to think about this and step away. And then to be ready to acknowledge the harm done and to do the repair that's necessary, right? And so, again, it's difficult. It says don't beat yourself up, but I have to tell you, sometimes that might be what happens and the guilt is real. But we always say, it's not a bad thing, however, don't stay there. Because staying there doesn't help. It's then to start to think, what's the action, right? And try to really, make sure that we are not stuck in the other person having to take care of us. So then the tears and all of that, it might be that we need to listen, hear, step away, process with some other people in our lives, and, you know, engage in that way. And that last piece, remember, as I was saying earlier, I don't know anybody who's the perfection, who's never ever said or done something that's offensive. And so, you know, to beat yourself up and think of you as a terrible person, well, that would probably be everybody in the world. I know some people don't want to acknowledge that, and some people never think that they are. I mean, I watch enough reality shows to see the ego in some folks, and I'm like, wow, how highly you think of yourself. But just to say that's really, really important, right? And I'm seeing in the chat some really important messages here, but important for leadership. Pause, breathe, model that practice. Grace, can you talk about RSD if you're comfortable? I've not heard that before. It'd be helpful.
Hi. Rejection sensitivity dysmorphia is a symptom of ADHD. It is when a simple amount, it could be as simple as someone giving a feedback and having an overly a reaction that is like that, you know, it's not going well. This is a terrible thing I'm doing. I'll never do this again. This person who outrightly rejected me, I'm never going to be friends with them. And it's just it's part of let's see, I'm just going to Google it. Rejection sensitivity dysphoria is when a person feels intense emotional pain related to rejection.
Very clear. Very clear. Thank you, Grace. Thank you. Suzanne.
Just to add, it's a little bit about the hardwiring of the brain and the neurodiversity with ADHD. I have it all over here too. And it's just the way that you experience what may be intended as non-personal criticism still comes across to you as the receiver in a very hyper extreme way, a hypercritical impact. And it's part of the wiring of your brain more than it is something about how the person has delivered their message to you. Thanks.
Thank you. That's really helpful. The way I interpret that for me is that the moment somebody says, I need to talk to you, or I want to talk to you, I go right into, oh my God, I must have done something really horrible. I'm the worst person in the world. And even when they, as you said, you gave the example, even when it's delivered to me in a very gentle way, I still walk away like, wanting to hit my, I can't believe I did that. So I think there's a little of that, if I'm understanding that kind of, you take it so intensely. And I know the extreme then is when for folks, they shut down. And I think as Grace was explaining, okay, I didn't want to be around that person because I feel so embarrassed. And then I just think it's all about me being this horrible person. And I think we really started to think about how how do we interrupt that in our spaces? That does create the best conditions for us to really engage with each other in these times. And I think in terms of the work you want to create with each other, because I think to tell the kinds of stories we want to tell, I think that our answers, particularly when we're telling stories about relived experiences, I think the folks that went before us would have valued having these spaces, didn't have those spaces. And I think we tell our stories sometimes to create that space to reimagine and re-engage with some of those issues that we know often have been downloaded to us, that we're sometimes carrying and needing to ourselves unpack and release, right? So really powerful. Thank you. Very helpful. And then Randolph, the noise of the inner. Randolph, that's such a, can you speak to that, Randolph? Really key.
Hi, I'm discovering with young people, especially young people, the self-criticism, and I think maybe it's coming from so much social media and the compare and despair that we are now sort of learning how to repair this generation that has cultivated this hypersensitive pain associated with any kind of constructive criticism, and it's so challenging and heartbreaking at the same time.
And I think you're speaking to Randolph also, we're in a whole other kind of environment in terms of social media, in terms of so much information. And also young people have gone through something I didn't go through in my youth, which is a pandemic and being locked away, and to have the anxiety around, I mean, except for those of us who lived through, you know, the Cold War and periods of the Cold War when you did worry if, you know, bombs are going to drop at some point, and when nuclear power was being discovered and all of that. And absolutely, but I think we're in a time now where so many things are folded intensely that, you know, folks, yeah. And also because of what happens on social media in terms of, you know, feedback and trolling and all those kinds of things that can really be impactful on how people experience any kind of feedback. So, and I see Randolph Kids, so I imagine you're probably working in, I'm assuming, working with in theater with those kinds of taking up those issues in terms of how you engage around and building the strength and the resources and the skill for them to engage around these kinds of issues.
And to be able to be free and creative in a room where they have so much self-judgment that, yeah, out of their heads and into their bodies with, you know, love and support for sure. And you're right. Yes, I'm working with kids 18 and under.
Great, right. So building that, you know, generations to come who are going to fill our spaces as well, with probably more to offer to these kinds of conversations and processes. Thank you. So I'm gonna just, yeah, and just shift gaslighting. Again, I'm quickly gonna reference this and move on, but this is one of the things that you've probably heard a lot of. It's funny, on the weekend, I was just with my sister because she said, I never heard that term before. We actually ended up pulling up the movie with Charles Boyer and Ingrid Bergman, which is how I actually remember as a kid watching that old black and white film. And so when I started hearing the word, I said, oh, this one with the film. And so it's just to my sister again, and just to me that if anybody, you know, in the industry, if you have not seen that, that's a great example of seeing how that all works. And this idea that you think that you are losing your mind and that what you're creating and saying isn't the real deal of what's going on, right? Fits with tone policing as well, you know, in a way. And it's all kinds of the ways that usually the folks who are in power and used to having power often will shut down again that challenge that power. And so really just being mindful of how that happens in our spaces. And I think it's really important when we look at that last piece about that, how blame gets shifted, right? So it's not about what's actually happening or the impact, but so the focus comes on your behavior, what you're doing, how you're acting, how you're thinking about it, right? And you're imagining it, or you're overreacting to situations, or you know, you are, you know, creating an account of the situation, which really and truly we don't want to engage with. If you think about the resistance to critical race theory, you know, in particular in the US, and also the recent discussion around the AP course around African-American studies in Florida, for example, and even the Don't Say Gay. So this kind of idea of like, we only want a certain version of history to be told, to be engaged with, for example, right? That's all making sense. And so when you receive feedback, again, thank you for sharing that. And this is just a script that you have in your package. And this is language just to think about using. Okay, so just to give you some things to think about. And I also know that you get better at this as you get more comfortable with the idea that, yes, we're creating a culture and environment where we are going to get feedback. We are agreeing to give each other feedback. We're agreeing that. And this is something to spend some time with. I know in your space, that first day talk, we're loading a lot onto it. I don't know what your experience is of how that goes, how much is said, but I think I'm offering here resources to think about how you move through that talk. And it might be even spending some time to say, what does it mean for us to receive feedback, or to call an issue or name an issue that might be occurring in our space? And what does it mean when it's not comfortable? Or what does it mean when we disagree? So it's really important to start to, the only way to ever do this all really well is to practice, right? Is to give it attention and to nurture it. So it does mean time. And this is where a production team has to agree that we're going to give it the time, and to see it as value added, because some of you I know have been on productions, because as I've done the work with equity, I know I've encountered folks who talk about being on certain productions that was amazing, because along with everything else, they did some of this. So just to think about how that gets built in. And so I'm going to jump over this because I'm mindful of time again, and I want you to get to at least, we did think we might at least get to 2 of our exercises, and one we can leave you with to follow through on. But I do want to get you to this next one. So here you can see things to remember. So your own patience with yourself, which we're saying. I like what Grace shared earlier with how the the facilitators of the Zoom session where the fat phobic jokes comments were made offered not only just let's call it, let's name it, but also resources, right? That there were resources offered. And so that's something for you to think about in your spaces as well. Do we provide the resources, right, to support folks to engage around these issues, and also particularly when there's impact. And so the next piece we're going to go into looking a little bit at trauma-informed will be really important just to think about that. And then that last piece about allyship, right? And you'll see in the deck, even if we don't get to it today, you'll see the comparison between allyship, which is usually traditional, kind of can be more pop. Doesn't mean it can't be, because many of us live our allyship in very much solidarity kind of ways, but just because it can become now sort of the buzzword without the actual, what does it mean to actually be risking alongside people who are vulnerable, that you see solidarity offers what we see as the much more active kind of way of being an ally, showing up as allies as well. And so I'm going to actually jump over this exercise because I don't think you got copies of it. Would have been fun, but I want to get you to the trauma-informed piece. And so trauma-informed care. So what's really important with why I find this really useful with groups is that it really gets us to think about the kind of environments we're creating in terms of safety and cultural safety particularly. And you have to think about it as an industry and the world we're living in right now, that for racialized and indigenous people, for marginalized groups, so queer folks, women, disabled folks, people of different religious affiliations, that even the theater world has not always had the kinds of equity that allowed for folks to be present in all the ways that they can be, without the code switching that you've probably seen on some of the other slides, right? That way where you're always adjusting yourself, your behavior to fit in, right? It's almost what we call the assimilationist versus the integration sort of model, right? Where you've got to shut down everything else, including what you bring to the creative process in terms of questioning, challenging, even though the creative process, that's its goal. And I want to acknowledge that, of course, many times that does exist. You have created spaces within the industry. There are specifically designated spaces as well that do that on an ongoing basis, but we know that there's more work that we can do around that. As we're doing that, though, it's how we deal with the what this can bring up for folks, as I said earlier, right? When we're going through people's lived experiences. And so whenever we have these moments of conflict around and racism or any kinds of oppression, we have to know that sometimes we're traumatizing folks based on histories of this oppression occurring, right? And so it is about understanding that how this is all playing itself out. And so then that second bullet point is really about how do we then have a stance that really, and that's why I'm saying encouraging that, how that upfront conversation happens, how we set the stage, how we put in place a framework is really important, right? And how we message what this experience is. And so just to walk you through an example of that is, have a situation, so impact of trauma. So when trauma occurs for folks, I don't know if and I know for me, it's that, you think of which one happens to me, you more instinctively. So you have that freeze initially. I can't believe that was what happened. And if I think back to that hall, when Kristen and I were facilitating that day, that didn't go so well. The scenario was playing out and you could see these different reactions in the room. Some people just sat there like, I can't believe what's happening here. Others were ready to, what, we got to do something. And others actually left the room. So literally we saw freeze, fight, and flight in that room in that day. And if anybody is having trouble recalling, it was when we were at the Elm Street YWCA here in Toronto that we had that meeting. And so, just to be mindful too of where you tend to land generally when you're in those impacts and moments. But this is also for you to recognize and when this is occurring around you in a space, how you know that something is awry that we need to call or name or address, right? And so really the key thing here with this is one, that it is a traumatic experience when discrimination, harassment, violence, bullying, or any of those happen. Reprisal being key, because that's one of the things many years ago when we did a survey with equity members, they said that one of the reasons they often don't speak up, they don't call people in or out or give feedback, is their fear that it will come back on them. And that fear is that I won't get casted again. My colleagues don't want to work with me. And I have to say, having been an investigator in a couple of cases, I have sometimes interviewed where you get that sense, well, I don't know why they made it such a big deal. So I've been able to authenticate a lot of what people have been saying on those surveys. And so just be recognized that that can be its own concerning. So you're working in an environment where lots of things happen around you that you're just putting up with because of your fear of the impact on your career. And then being accused of it can also be traumatic, right? We always want to be clear that experiencing it is certainly much more weighted, but we know that for many of us who live in privileged spaces, that we recognize that some of what we have to carry is the weight of history that we benefit from, right? As unfair as it is. And at times when we want to be, down and in solidarity with our colleagues, just have to acknowledge and engage with the fact that sometimes we might be positioned without even meaning to or realizing it, just because of the nature of how history has shaped our different positionalities as well, right? And then, so the key thing to move ahead with is being aware of the prevalence of trauma, including in ourselves, recognition of when it happens, the impact, so that fight, flight, or freeze, and then responding. So again, and this responding is why, it's that, are we upfront about it? Do we have things in place? As Grace modeled with that other facilitation, can we identify those resources? And so this is something for equity to think about, even as we're on these Zoom sessions or these trainings, what will be some things we'd offer? And it's really important that Haven, that is also in your package, is an example of information that I think is promoted by equity to keep messaging that you've got that resource to call on to get support as well. And then resisting re-traumatization. So being mindful when you think about tone policing, gaslighting, that those kinds of things are things that re-traumatize. And even as we're sharing examples of, say, videos or any other things that you're doing in your own productions, how those can also put people through experiences. So it's important then to be upfront with naming, laying out, here's where we're going, here's what it looks like, here's how it might sometimes become unsafe. What do we need to put in place so that we can maybe check in those moments? It's almost like having that code word for when we've hit somewhere where, oh, this is now not feeling right. And how do I know that in my body? I remember once interviewing a production where they talked about that they did a good few, pre-period where they did a lot of trauma work just to prepare themselves to go into the production where they know a number of issues would play themselves out. And that apparently is something that was new to many of the participants, who had also been in other productions, that they left a little wobbly from. So just to keep that in mind as you're even entering into new productions. Let me just pause here to see, Scott, if there's anything in the chat to comment on, or
there's been some helpful links put in here. The meeting package has been redistributed again. There's a link to the YouTube channel, which Equity is maintaining, and there's info on the Haven helpline, which is the helpline that we have for our members when they experience something that happens to them in the workplace in the realm of discrimination, bullying, sexual harassment, racism, anything like that. The Haven helpline is there for them to get help and to get information on what their options are to move forward with that. Look for solutions for their situation.
Thank you. And Nicole, thank you for.
Douglas, sorry, it's
Go ahead.
Valerie speaking. I just wanted to bring our attention to Grace's addition of fawning. Fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. The idea of someone placating because they can't deal with, the discomfort. I think that's a really interesting addition to think about.
Thank you. Very, very helpful. And Nicole also put in the chat, I think, really important that it's not a single event. It's an event, it's an ongoing process of also care. And that's why I talked about communities of care. How do we say we're a community of care? And it's good to also, think about, don't only think about this when something happens. How are we facilitating engagement around these issues in an ongoing way that keeps an environment alive? And something that a term I've used in my work that people have found helpful is that when folks come into any of our spaces, they should feel like they've been thought about. Meaning that they walk and think, oh, there's different things available in the space that have anticipated that I might be here and I might be having the experience I'm having. So all these lists I'm really thankful and reflecting on this list of resources you're all adding, because this to me is the kinds of things like when we're in a production team or in a rehearsal hall that we're all bringing together as a community to say, what about this? Could we think about this? Can we try this? Can we do one of these exercises? Can we, so that you're really pulling that together to keep facilitating the kind of space. That doesn't mean we have to wait till something happens and then we react to, but that we have things in place that helps us to better respond, if that helps. Grace, do you want to talk a bit? I just give you some space to talk about fawning before, just because it's such a key thing what you're saying, and I want to make sure people are clear about it.
Hi. Yes, it is like fight, flight, freeze, fawning. It is when it is in a reaction to a confrontation in which you try your best to de-escalate. But sometimes it appears as agreement to the party that is saying or doing something that is harmful. But it is a response, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I'm not sure that answers the question. It's a concept that came up in another Zoom call that I attended, and it was like, that makes so much sense to me, because sometimes you can't escape the situation and you've got to de-escalate, but sometimes the de-escalating makes the other participants that are being harmed by this situation to feel like, oh, I can't, I have no recourse now, because it appears that there's the power dynamic, and then there's people that are agreeing with this. So where do I go from there? Thank you.
No, thank you. And Valerie has also added some text, which is really helpful. Thank you for that. What it makes me think of is also what can feel patronizing. It can also feel trivializing. It can also feel a way, it's kind of, okay, they're there. And so the language and the tone can also be, offensive in some ways. And so I think there are versions of this fawning in terms of what you're saying about somebody, defaulting to a very, oh, I'm sorry. And, but it doesn't feel like it's authentic in terms of taking up the issues and appreciating the impact of behavior, which is what's really key. And so it's really unpacking that in terms of accountability. And I think I'm going to the other extreme now. And I think of one example I had many years ago was I was doing a presentation and somebody came over to me and they kneeled down, it was in person, and they said to me, your accent is very melodic and it's very entertaining. However, if you could just slow it down for those of us who has difficulty following along, I'd really appreciate it. And I remember sitting there thinking, okay. And this was some years ago, and I reflect on it many, many times. But, just to think about those different ways in how this can happen. So I'm getting feedback, but the way I'm getting it, if that makes sense, if that helps folks to think about that a little bit. Right? Yeah, I'm going to move you to this last. We're going to watch this video. I'm going to give you a short amount of time just to have a little discussion. Actually, no, we're going to watch the video, and there will be a scenario. And I think we'll be able to just make it because we know we have to be wrapped up by 4. And so let me just find the video. Okay, here we go. And so to set up the video and also to model the trauma-informed approach is to say, this video is about Indigenous people's experiences, particularly under colonization. And so it's a woman who's talking about the impact of sort of, the dynamic of discussions around the Queen's passing and her own differential experience as an Indigenous woman who is a generational survivor of the residential school system. So, just give you a chance to decide whether you want to, it's about 3 minutes long. If you want to step away, turn off your computer if it's not something you want to engage with, or just to be taking care of yourself as you're watching it. And then we'll just check in after you watch it with a scenario.
Queen Elizabeth's death and the accession of King Charles has revived a long-standing debate about the monarchy's role in Canada's colonial history. All the ceremonies and the outpourings of grief for the late Queen has generated mixed emotions. And as Neetu Garcha explains, for some Indigenous people, it's provoked unresolved intergenerational trauma. And a warning, this story may be disturbing for some viewers. Hi, everyone. I'm Doreen Manuel. I'm the director of the BOSA Center for Film and Animation.
A start of the school year welcome at Capilano University from a matriarch who developed many of the programs these students are taking. But what few here know about the filmmaker and educator is the trauma she carries as a survivor of the Port Alberni Residential Institution.
I had my head held underwater until I passed out. I was just a child.
A child who grew up enduring systemic abuse she says the monarchy is directly responsible for.
Think of an 8-year-old child in your life, you know, with their hands just bloody from being strapped. That monarchy and that government has sanctioned the genocide of my people. They sanctioned children being raped and murdered.
Manuel says she's had to shut out social media and people in her life to cope since the Queen's passing and the mass adoration that's followed.
I still have nightmares. I still have to sleep with a nightlight. I'm in my 60s, and now they're going to continue it now with a king. You know, they got rich from our lands while we lived in poverty, while we starved to death. I ate chicken feed when I was a little girl because there was nothing else to eat.
Her father, a legendary leader known by many today as the visionary behind the modern reconciliation movement, was traveling fighting for Indigenous sovereignty worldwide.
Expand the powers that you have so as we can control our fishing rights.
Continuing her father's fight against oppression, Manuel says the royal family needs to take more action on advancing truth and reconciliation, compensation for Indigenous communities, and supporting the Land Back movement. Calls echoed by Diana Day of the Pacific Association of First Nations Women, who's also urging King Charles to immediately denounce the doctrine of discovery, a philosophy that legitimized the colonization of Indigenous people around the globe.
We fought with them during the wars, all the wars, and helped to establish Canada. And then we got left behind.
There's so much need all the time. And I just forget about what I'm going through, what's hurting me. And I just focus on that. And it always gets me through.
A powerful example of the sensitivity needed in this moment as survivors like Manuel work on healing through the hurt. Neetu Garsha, Global News, North Vancouver.
So, you know, when I show a clip like that, just give a moment for breathing, taking space, any comments, feedback. We have one scenario related to this that we'll do together. We're going to just break it, but I think it was valuable to do it together just for time. And then we'll make sure that we point out some of the other resources that you can follow up on your own. But just to give some space for any reactions to the video or thoughts or reflections. And if not, we'll move on to the scenario and then we'll have a discussion online together, on Zoom together. Just quickly to reference, I did see some back and forth in the chat, and I'm going to encourage and maybe you would do this anyway, Randy and Ilona, is to, if we can copy the chat, actually, if people are okay with copying the chat, we'll remove the names, of course, put them there. Because there's some good back and forth that would be good. I'm seeing here a good clarification. Here's some talk about feedback in action. You know, some good dialogue here around what it means to normalize, but I'm hearing, and I understood actually what was meant, Nicole, but I see Valerie clarifying for everybody's benefit, because initially I did read the normalize, think, oh, I don't know if you want to normal, but I used to the point is to create space for the fact that that is how some people might show up. And how do we acknowledge that and maybe name that and process what that can look like and how tools are provided for different ways of approaching things. So really good back and forth in the chat, but it made me think it'd be helpful to copy some of this chat as some things that people could actually bring to other productions that they're in as well. Thank you. And then Jane is saying, different eyes, a different lens to look at an issue. Right. So let me go to the scenario, because this might help keep unpacking this video. Because let's think about if this were to happen in our spaces, right? Or in your spaces. So if we look at the scenario, so so let's me read this properly. You're in rehearsals when the announcement is made that Queen Elizabeth II has died. On the bio break, meaning you go bathroom break, cast members check their phones and come back to the rehearsal room commenting on the news. One woman says weepily how sad she is that the world has lost such an incredible role model. She begins to wax on, uninterrupted, about how glamorous the royals are. You catch yourself intrigued with what she is saying and thinking about how you two watched Harry and Meghan's wedding. You look around the room and notice the faces of two of the racialized cast. Their expressions range from disdain to anger. How do you feel? What do you do next? And I think this was sent to everyone. I think you also have copies of this scenario in your package. So again, we'll just have a general conversation about thinking about what we're talking about in terms of anti-oppressive communication, just having watched that video clip, and then you're in a rehearsal hall and this moment happens. What are some thoughts, reflections, feedback, some strategies that you think would be important in responding here or helping this conversation move forward? And so you can put it in the chat, but we'd love to hear from some folks also in general. So Alice.
Yes, hi. Thank you. This reminds me also of when we take a pause to think about what's November 11th. Sorry, I'm not Canadian, so I forget.
Remembrance Day.
Thank you, Remembrance Day, and how, like, depending on who's in the room, not everyone wants to take that pause and stuff like that. So me not being from Canada and not really caring much about the royal family, like, I don't think I would, like, I would acknowledge what is happening and how, like, there will be two different viewpoints at minimum. And I think once we're back from the break, we would probably just discuss and say, let's acknowledge what we just heard and how this can be good or bad, not good or bad news, but like how people can take this news in different ways, and maybe just open it up and say, does anybody want to discuss this for like 20 minutes or whatever? And then like we can wrap it up and continue the rehearsal, or should we just leave this out of the room and like continue with the rehearsal? Like, I think that's how I would handle it. But I find the same sort of thing when Remembrance Day comes up as well.
Thank you, Alice. Other folks, this is happening in your industry, your rehearsal hall. And I don't know if it did come up for some folks, right? When this occurred, because it certainly came up in lots of different organizations I worked with. This scenario, when we use it, it's quite a discussion of different perspectives. Nicole, I think it would be important to acknowledge the feelings in the room, that the emotions in the room are complex. I'd rely on Nicole Brewer's Anti-Racist Theaters Foundation course, part of her session agreements. All feelings are valid, all truth is valid. I would prioritize the needs of BIPOC in the room. So very much a trauma-informed approach, Nicole, is what you're really saying, is like, who is most harmed here or could potentially be harmed by the histories taken up here? Because for the folks for whom there's value in terms of how they see the Queen, there are folks for whom, you know, there's a history in relationship to that that also needs to be acknowledged. Thank you. A break, calling for a break. Valerie saying space was created to discuss different perspectives. Okay. Other folks.
And sorry, that was different perspectives were valued. So both Indigenous and people that might support the monarchy in their life. This person was from Newfoundland and has had a picture of the Queen in her house her whole life. So both of those perspectives were valued and discussed.
Right. Any other thoughts on this? I mean, there was some, for example, I'd say there's maybe some thoughts to say, but shouldn't we get to a particular current truth in 2020, 23 moving forward, right? In terms of what we're learning about the doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny, the colonial trauma, much that's, and in fact, there's a lot of research. I follow Professor Beckles out of the Caribbean, University of the West Indies, and he's the vice chancellor there, and he's doing some research. He's actually all over the internet right now because some of his research is, just reviewing all kinds of records. And one of the examples that was startling, my background is Jamaican, and one of the startling examples he said was that, during the reign of the British, over 1.3 million African people were enslaved and brought to Jamaica. And within 200 years, there were only 300,000 left. So the question becomes, what happened over that time to those 1.3 million who you'd think were also being encouraged to have children to create slave labor and all of that, but that they were so decimated within that length of time. And what I understood from that as well is that the British were then regularly having to, because there was such a high rate of death, in that one point, they kept having to replenish the workforce, the African workforce. And so some of the conversation was about the kind of genocidal experience that occurred in that relationship to the British Crown, quite, to be frank. And then you've also got the whole story of Haiti that you've probably been hearing about in terms of, one of the things that's always been startling for me to always hear is that, for slave holders to agree to end slavery, they had to be compensated. So in our dollars, billions of dollars were paid out, even after they'd benefited from the free labor of African peoples. And then, of course, South Asian peoples who were brought over as indentured servants, and East Asian folks in some cases as well. So there's quite a bit of a history that you can imagine for some people in this kind of situation would be saying, but do we want to land somewhere that, and I think if any of you want to see a really, and some of you watch Trevor, if you watch Trevor Noah, he did a really good piece on this. And I think some of you are quoting from that. Which is, what I'm hearing, as Valerie said, those of us who, and I have to tell you, if I'm honest with you, it really shook me when I heard, because I thought, yeah, this person's been was on my money, still on our money, I think. And so, you live with something, and so it's a certain phenomena, but then there's also another parallel story. So just to be prepared that when we're in these environments, it may not be such an easy landing as, oh, let's hold space for everybody, because for some of us, it might be traumatically. But I want to understand, where are we landing in terms of a positioning around this history? And I think we're still, and I don't expect you to have an answer now, but just to know that that is a reckoning that we're having now with that certain idea of how we value and hold multiple stories at once, when there's a particularly strong trend of a story that is telling a particular kind of truth to live with. And this is where we might get into issues of fragility that can be things that we have to wrestle with, right? And unfortunately, that might be its own other workshop at some point down the line to work through, to process that. But I just want to flag that, so I don't leave you with oh yeah, you just have multiple, because sometimes it's not as straightforward as that, as I think you all appreciate and know. Okay, so on that note, we're at our time. If you have other thoughts, reflections, please send them through. Scott will probably say a few words and check in if there's any questions amiss.
I will. And thank you so much, Douglas. Just a couple of things. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Douglas. It's always illuminating to have you addressing the members and sharing your knowledge and experience on these issues. This is really, really important stuff, and it's always good to have you with us when we're talking about these things. I'd like to thank Amanda and Cynthia for their ASL interpretation. And also to all the members for attending today. If you've missed any of our previous workshops, you can find them on Equity's YouTube channel. We have a survey that will be coming out to you. Please fill that out. That really helps us in creating future webinars. And I just want to say one last thing about our Safe and Respectful Workplace Task Force. They're reviewing all of the documents that go along with our Not in Our Space initiative. So I'm just going to put a thing in the chat here. Oops, that went to the host. That did not go to everybody. Everyone in meeting, here we go. So there's all our documents that guide how we handle our workspaces, professional conduct in our workspaces, guides for assisting members when they encounter harassment, racism, or discrimination. Take a look at that page because all of those documents are there. And if you have feedback on how to improve or clarify those documents, please send your comments to communications@caea.com. We will be looking at that feedback as it comes in. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. It's 1 o'clock here on the West Coast. I'm going to sign off on behalf of everybody here at Equity. We'll see you the next time around. Thanks for attending and talk to you soon.